Hello, all you positive heads. Welcome to a very special episode dedicated to none other than you, the PeaHeads themselves. I am your PeaHead enthusiast and hostess for the day, Alexa Hauser. I have been blessed to have the experience of helping out with Positive Head social media for the better part of a year. And through my digital interactions, I began to realize, as did Brandon, that we have some incredible beings listening to the show who are taking the information that Brandon puts out through the podcast and using it to transform their lives and create wonderful things. You listeners are all a huge, huge part of the life force that propels this show forward through time and space. And we think it's time to bring forth some of you beautiful reflections and delve a little deeper into this collection of energy that is the Positive Head community. So as we shine the spotlight on our listeners, what we'll have them do is share their stories of how they attracted Positive Head into their life, the transformation it's facilitated for them, and what they're focused on creating now that they're in a more positive headspace. Also, this episode of the Positive Head podcast is being brought to you thanks to the support of Gaia. If you're not familiar, Gaia is the go-to source for streaming consciousness content online. And you can sign up for your first month for only 99 cents at gaia.com/positivehead. That's spelled GAIA.com/positivehead. Check it out. Hello, all you positive heads. On this week's PeaHead Posse episode, our guest is Lynn DeSilva-Johnson. Lynn, aka Eli, is a change agent working at the intersection of multimodal, creative practice, social entrepreneurship, education, and energy work. In addition to countless ongoing creative projects and collaborations, facilitating workshops and performing widely, they founded and run the nonprofit organization, The Operating System, and teach at Pratt Institute in New York City. Hi, Lynn. Welcome to the show.
Oh my God, PeaHead Posse.
You're here.
Here. What's up, Alexa? It's so good to see Alexa's face. All you PeaHeads out there, you are like missing out. Yeah, that's we know you're here with us.
That's why if you're listening to this and you have a story to share, you should email me because we can FaceTime like we're doing right now.
Okay, God.
Yeah. What's up? How are you?
Oh my God, I'm so good. I've been like deep in writing this like essay about somatic practice this morning. So I'm like deep in that mindset right now.
Ooh, somatic practice.
Yeah. So yeah.
Any like quick hit tidbits you want to share about that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I've been working through myself in the last couple of years has to do with like how trauma lives in my body and in other bodies, and how it manifests itself in chronic illness and other things. And as a educator, something that I found myself teaching about and thinking about a lot is like something that's known as embodied cognition, right? Which has to do with like the fact that actually the body and the mind like are totally connected, right? The idea, this very sort of enlightenment idea that like the mind is over here and like the body is this other thing that needs to be repressed is like totally bonkers. And yet like really that's how we teach. The way that we learn and the way that we teach, like institutionally, is actually really sort of in this Cartesian model of like how the mind and body are divided. And as I worked with my own sort of process of retraining my body and body hacking around trauma, I started realizing that like, wow, the classroom is still a place where like I can't help but like reinforce these systems because that's how it's institutionally done, right? It's really, really hard to like bring embodiment into the classroom and institutions because like in order for kids to get all their work done, they actually have to ignore their bodies, et cetera, right? So there's all of this kind of like really deeply embedded sort of understanding of like how the mind and body work as the way that we learn, and we actually like really get programmed in those spaces and carry them on into our own lives and practice. So I've been like really trying to like help both individuals and educators and creative people sort of like recognize where that lives and hack it and beyond that. So that's what I was writing this morning. So I'm deep in that mode.
That is fascinating, especially to me, because I'm an EFT practitioner and, it's all about that, all about that understanding of how connected it really all is. And, how like the body can really hold on to trauma and any sort of emotion that isn't processed. And so wait, you mentioned hacks. So what is like a hack? How do you hack it?
So one of the things that I like to say, like one of the workshops that I teach is called like How to Human, and it's meant to be like tongue in cheek. It's not like I know how to human and you don't. Like the idea is sort of like if you were learning how to drive or you were learning like a skill set, you would be given like if there was a machine or something that was necessary to you to do that thing, someone would teach you how that machine works, like the basic processes and the basic, like operating systems, and like that's what you would do. But we don't do that with the human body. Actually, it's like this really bizarre thing where like the thing that is most central to our every single day of our lives, which is like being in a human body, is not actually like part of our learning process. Like it's sort of random. And so like if you've ever heard of Moshe Feldenkrais, like he is the person that founded the Feldenkrais method, which is something that dancers use a lot, but it's sort of like a reprogramming of the musculoskeletal system, like to help you sort of like hack the way that you learn and experience the world. And so like he writes about like the difference between animals and humans, right? Where one is like phylogenetic and the other is ontogenetic, which means that like animals like will learn all their instinctive processes. They just will genetically. But humans, it's random. Like if you happen to have the right environment, like, or you happen to go through the certain behaviors, like you will, but otherwise you won't. And this is pretty bananas, right? So you don't know that, for instance, like, oh, when I get really nervous, if I practice parasympathetic nervous system breathing, which means that like you're breathing out for longer than you're breathing in, which is something that happens in nature when you're safe. When you're really nervous, you're naturally going to be trying to draw in breath to give it to the processes of their body that you need when you're in fight or flight. But so like knowing something as simple as sort of like if you can slow your breath down and check and plug into your parasympathetic nervous system, then your body can go into what's known as like rest and digest, allowing your hormones to work in a way that's more congenial to you and moving all these things into, so it's things like that. Some of it's kind of just like, moving practices and the, with the body, a lot of sort of mindfulness body scan type of stuff, which has to do with like recognizing tension and learning how to dispel it. So there's all of these different hacks, right? So it's kind of like putting it all together, and not, I think what a lot of people do, when we go into mindfulness training or we start doing yoga or whatever, like, or even if we start getting body work done. When I was really acutely sick, I was getting a ton of energy work done and I was working with Chinese medicine and it wasn't really like working. And I've really come to feel like it's because I really didn't understand what needed to be changed. I only really understood the symptoms, but I didn't really understand the root. And I really didn't understand like what was happening in my body. And so like, sometimes we can't even heal until those pathways are sort of clarified, right? And so, totally. When I teach around this, it has to do with not only learning the hacks, but also really starting to understand these other processes and like why it is that we have ended up with this patterning, and also like what's happening sort of neurologically and so forth. Yeah. So like, that's what I'm thinking about today.
I love it. I'm like on the edge of my seat. I love that topic. Like, I think that is so fascinating. And did you say you're writing a book?
So right now I'm writing an essay. Okay. I have been doing, this particular essay is going to be part of a book that is coming out. I don't know when it's coming out, but it came out of a symposium that I was part of last year called Feminist Practice Emergent Pedagogies. And yeah, I have a bunch of different kind of essays that are somewhat related to that in some way coming out, but I also have a book which is like an open source workbook and guide, which I made as part of a collaborative co-facilitated workshop that I did around this with another performance artist and a choreographer dancer as part of a residency called, you're going to love this, Resistance Fantasies.
Wow.
Here. I know, right?
Yes.
That's so sexy.
What a name.
In New York at the Target Margin Theater in January. So we made a book, because a lot of what I do with the organization that I run has to do with like documentation as a methodology for ongoing sustainable practice, right? So like when you do something and it's really effective, how do we document that intelligence so that it's not only contingent to you being in the room, right? So not only did we write down sort of the back end of our workshop, but we also wrote down all of the exercises, and we also wrote down the structure of the workshop. So like you can take this book and you can do the work, but you can also teach the workshop, and we want you to, right?
That
or you can co-facilitate it with your friends, or you can just like get super into it because there's like a 15-page bibliography. You can be like, go do your own work. So that's a lot of like what I try to do. It's sort of like with my own work and with other people's, I'm sort of like, what are you doing that's like really valuable? And how does this get into the archive? And how does this get disseminated so that other people can practice it? Because we often don't have the resources to kind of like put ourselves in all of those rooms, right? We can't. It's just not possible scale wise. But resources and tech and online information and open source information allows that to be possible on a scale that like has never before been seen, right? So that's a lot of kind of where my work with my organization like happens, is kind of at that intersection of documentation and dissemination.
That is cool. I need you in my life because
I'm in your life.
You're here now. Yeah. Like as you're talking, I'm like, oh, that's exactly the part that, you know, it's so interesting just as you're describing that, to think about all the different kind of like how each of our interests and passions really kind of start to put us each in these roles that are a part of the, I don't want to call it the machine, but a part of what's happening, right? Yeah. And you're the part that, you know, gets that. You get how to take something and scale it. You get how to take something that might have only, you know, lived within a small circle and get it out so that everyone has access to it. And I think that's really cool. So,
I mean, I've always said that like ultimately I'm a systems theorist, like I'm a systems thinker, and I've always been thinking that way. And I think that, you know, I think administration is like really sexy and not like given enough kind of credit, you know, like as an artist or someone in the arts, people are always like, how do you do everything that you do? I'm like, legit spreadsheets.
Spreadsheets like, for the win.
That like I woke up and I was a super genius and like looked at myself in the mirror and was like, you have all the ideas. It's like, no, it's because I have like a Google Drive that does not quit and has like a million like linked files, and all these people have access to it, and there's like all of this beehive going on, you know. I mean, that's really so much of why I think that people are successful, you know, and I think there's a lot of books around this, but I really do think that it's undervalued in a lot of our circles because it's like really not seen as like the interesting thing, right? It's not like it's like, oh, you're an artist, like you want an intern to do that or something. Yeah, but like it's also really creative, right? It's really creative, and understanding that work will both make you more valuable and make things more viable for you, you know? Yeah. Another thing we just like don't get taught and kind of leave to chance. It's like, are you good at administration? Like, no, none of us are.
Oh, totally.
You know, I think business, you know, like I think about business a lot. I'm kind of an artist who like reads Fast Company and Inc. and people are like, oh, okay. I'm like, yeah, well, I have to. I think about that. But it's sort of like, you know, you see products come and go that are amazing. Like it has nothing to do with whether the product is great. That's not. It has nothing to do with whether the restaurant made great food, right? Like that's not why something succeeds. So much of it is organization and understanding the system within which it works and understanding the context, right? So I'm kind of here to be like, listen, like we're going to all work on this together. Like let's make better systems so that we can sustain what we want in the world, because otherwise it's not going to last. Even if it's great, it's not going to last.
Yes. Oh, I love everything you're about right now. It's crazy. I'm just sitting here thinking, I'm like, it's crazy how the universe works, because like 2 weeks ago, so I'm a really creative person. I'm way more creative than structured. Like I've always been kind of this like idea person, but structure has lacked in my life. And in the past few years, I've been getting
language out of that binary, Alexa.
I'm sorry. But in the past couple of years, I've like gotten more like, I've become more attracted to, like you're saying, like systems and having things organized and having things accessible. And just a couple of weeks ago, I suddenly started, do you know who Gary V is? Like Gary Vaynerchuk?
No.
He's, well, anyway, he's like an entrepreneur, but he's really big on kind of some of the things you're saying about like systems and like all about marketing and like why things succeed and why things fail, and really talking about a lot of stuff you're talking about. And I don't know why, just like a couple weeks ago, I started listening to him and I can't stop. Whereas a couple years ago, I tried to listen and it was like not in alignment with me at all. And
you'd be super into Seth Godin too, if you're
yes, I love Seth Godin.
Okay, I got it.
This is what I'm saying. I'm saying it's so funny. Just a couple weeks ago, suddenly I'm aligned, and now you're here, and everything you're saying, I'm like, yes, this is like a part of my life. I think I'm opening up to more and shifting into. So it's so cool that we're brought together. And this is like the first episode. We just dove in, which I love. But I would love to hear, more about your story and what your journey's been like.
Oh, man. I mean, what a journey. It's like, how long do we have? I mean, I think I started talking a little bit about it before, right? So like me personally, like I've always been, if I was answering Krista Tippett's first question, which is like, how did spirituality like live in your life as a child? It would be like, I was always kind of like a little mystic. Like I would go into like spaces of worship and like weep. Like as a child, like as a young child. But I've always felt like super, super plugged in energetically, like both to like the natural world as well as to like divinity in some way. But I was like raised Catholic, and I was like, this is not for me, but I still feel very connected to things. And I also like went to a Quaker school, which was like really amazing. Like, so if you know anything about Quakers, like whereas the Catholics were like, there's all this stuff in between. Quakers are like, here's the light, it is inside you, and you can just have a direct line and it's fine. So it's very akin to Buddhism, which I found eventually, right? And like mindful practice. But I also, I grew up in New York City, and with a single parent family, and I had really amazing opportunities to go to like amazing schools. We didn't have a lot of money, so I was like on scholarships, and I was really surrounded by a lot of creative energy. But I also was in a family that was, I talk a lot in my work now about precarity. So we were very precarious, right? And I was always very aware of that precarity. And I think that like this is true in a lot of immigrant families in particular. We were sort of like post-Cold War, post-Depression, sort of like Italian American factory worker kind of families. And like that was very present in my life. And so I think a lot of the decisions that I was making and a lot of the pressures that I felt were very sort of informed by this like precariousness and by this fear. Oh my God, just like fear. Just like my mom is a very creative and incredible and intelligent person, but also like dominated by fear, like someone just dominated by fear to the extent that like doesn't want the cable person to come over without someone there, would never go into the forest by themselves, like doesn't like to get into a cab unless there's someone else there. You know what I mean? Like very like everything. And so I was very much brought up simultaneously being exposed to all this amazing stuff while also getting all this kind of fear embedded in me. And it was really an interesting combination because I didn't really know what to do with that intersection. And so I really dove into books, and I dove into school, and I dove into creative practice, where I found a lot of people that felt more connected to me than anyone I actually knew. I think though, like living in New York City, I always felt kind of very connected to like the larger creative world. Like I lived in Brooklyn, but my mom worked, and I went to school in like the Lower East Side. This is like the 1980s Lower East Side, like East Village, New York. And so like a very creative time. But also the city is like falling apart, and like there's drugs everywhere, and it's a disaster, and like everyone is dying of AIDS, and it's terrible. But I always feel kind of like I was raised by the city a little bit. And I always felt very inspired by this place and how it made people and how I interfaced with this like physical environment. And so I ended up sort of like going into and writing about the urban space, urban environment. And so like I went to school, and I went both for art and anthropology. And then I went and did a master's in urban design. And then I went back to school for anthropology again for like a doctoral degree, and which I didn't finish. But as an adult, a lot of that like inherited trauma and fear, like I was always sick. I was sick all the time. Like I started getting really sick like in high school. Like anytime I would have a break, I would be sick, deeply sick, like sick in ways that doctors could never figure out. And then I got diagnosed with endometriosis, like in a very serious way. I spent the last week of my college career in the hospital, and I had to have this major surgery. And of course, it was like misdiagnosed, and women's health is so much like this. I now consider myself non-binary, but at the time, it was a different time. It was the late 90s. And so that doesn't really exist then. No one was really using that language. And so, in a female body, like dealing with the medical establishment has been kind of like the story of my adult life, has been kind of like interfacing with Western medicine and being like, this is not working for me. And simultaneously, like finding kind of answers to the way in which my family was in these other spiritual practices, right? So working with Buddhism, working with shamanic practice, medicine practice from the Karo tradition in Peru, not using plant medicine, but just traditional medicine practice, and really just kind of like finding myself able to give myself agency in ways that my family had not been. And then kind of starting to build systems to help other people do that. That kind of was like the big transition for me. I was sort of like, oh, why am I able to do this? What's happening here? And realizing what kind of resources and infrastructure I needed, which I didn't have. I was kind of understanding how to do it for myself, but I was like, there's no infrastructure for this, right? And like, I can't sustain this without other people. And I know so many other people who are in a similar situation. Like, I think especially with a creative practice, like I had always gotten the sense like, my mom always was like, I wasn't allowed to do creative practice. You should do it. But also it can't be the thing that you do because that is not safe, right? Like that's not safe. And so I always got this message that like, it was somehow very selfish to buy things that were for my creative practice. Like it wasn't really something that was allowed for me. And yet I really do think that, especially now with so much xenophobia, and so much like media getting in our minds around like who other people are and their countries, et cetera. Like, I think that the spaces of creativity, when we work creatively together and when we are inspired by other people's creative practice, like we are most able to connect as humans, right? Like if you're in a room with a group of people and you don't talk to any of them and you all see music together and you're like super like moved by this music, and then you have a conversation with someone after and you learn that that person has like super different political beliefs from you. You're sort of like, because you had this incredibly moving experience together that you felt really connected through, there is a kind of a little bit of a fissure in the idea that this person is super different from you because of this kind of like other shared human emotional connection, right? So I think that like when we read books from other countries and we're like, oh, that person is a human, not what I would have called them, right? They're not this I invented idea of the nationality that I had placed on them. They're actually like a human and they were born somewhere else, right? And so, I think that, and someone said to me once, who's a musician that I know, he's like, I was in Italy and I was thinking, wow, the only thing we really remember thousands of years later is the art. No one cares about anyone doing anything else. Like, it's the only thing that lasts, right? Is like art, music, architecture, and a little bit of philosophy and like math. But like other than that, unless you're like the de Medicis, no one knows who's banking. No one cares. Like right? Like that's what lasts, like human ideas, because that's what we continue to strive to do. We strive to understand ourselves. So I kind of was like, wow, like this got totally reversed for me. I really thought that like I was going to have to do this as a secondary practice, but it might be the most important thing that I do in the world, like is creative practice in some way. And so I'm teaching, right? And so I was like, how do I help other people feel this agency, right? And like also not only feel the agency, but feel like it's tangibly a thing that's available to them. Yeah. So I started like, taking my sort of systems analysis stuff, which I was doing anyway as a scholar, and turning it to building this infrastructure, right? And building this organization. And so like now, which is crazy. So one of the major things that we do is publish. So like by I've like lost track of the numbers, but I think that it's like by next year, we started on paper publishing like in print, I don't know, 7 years ago or something. But like by next year, we'll have like 80, 90 books in print or something.
Wow.
Like so many. Yeah. And more digital books and tons of stuff online and all this kind of infrastructural open source guides and resources and stuff, just like this massive, massive amount of stuff. And it's actually kind of like amazing. So one of the things that we're doing, speaking of connecting to other countries, is like, no one knows this like out of publishing. And I just learned this a couple of years ago. What percentage, here's a question, what percentage of books published in the United States would you say are in translation, like come from another language first? Given how connected we are, what percent do you think it might be?
I have no idea. I don't know. 25%?
4. So it's 4%. And then actually, if you want to know what the number is of like books that are like artistic or literature, 1%. And of that 1%, you better believe that most of it is like new editions of like Dante, right? Like things that have been published like a million times. The actual number of like books in translation that are like creative or new books from other countries is something like 600 a year, which if you understand the number of books being put out in the United States is like nothing bananas, like nothing. And so like now we publish translation. It's a big thing that we now do. And so like this year we published 7. If I'm publishing 7 translations, that means we have changed the number of translations of artistic work in the United States by 1%. That is ridiculous. That's a ridiculous number. So, I mean, it's kind of this moment of, you know, like the manifestation kind of question. It's sort of like, there's no reason on paper that I should be able to do any of this. I mean, you know, it's not like, it doesn't make sense like monetarily, but it does work, you know, along a sort of like Charles Eisenstein, like understanding of like sacred economics and like moving resources energetically, to make things manifest in the world, you know? And that's again, people are like, how can you do this? I'm like, listen, it is possible. I swear to you, but your body doesn't believe that you can.
So how do you make your body believe that you can?
Well, so you go through that somatic self-hacking, right?
Nice.
And you start to recognize that you weren't the person that your idea that you can't did not come from you, that actually that's learned, right? That like, the idea that you have these limitations is no matter how, and I think like, you know, in academia and scholarship, like this is, I write a lot about and understand totally like systemic inequalities, right? And so there's certain people and certain bodies for whom like limitations and precarity is much stronger force. It's a much stronger force.
Yeah.
Right. And for whom those like blocks are much more real. They're real, right? Real in the world. Like, you know, whether or not we can then change that energetically, whether my blocks are worse than yours is kind of another question. And I think that sometimes when we talk solely energetically, we run the risk of saying that the things don't exist, right? That like someone doesn't have more things against them than the other. Well, it's like, yeah, we may both be able to achieve it, even though we didn't think we could. But it doesn't mean that there isn't more stacked against you, right? Because like when you have experienced a ton of trauma, when you have experienced a lot of like resistance, when there is sort of a lot systemically not working in your favor, energetically, it does take more work to do that. You have to retrain your body more. Right. So like as someone dealing with trauma in the body, like I've had stuff to work through that is very specific to me. But I think that's something else for us to remember. And this is kind of a very Occupy thing is like more people are dealing with trauma than you realize. Right. Like like trauma doesn't only look like you were abused or you got hit by a car or, you know, like trauma lives in you can actually really feel it. Like when you go to another country where there's more social services, for instance, and you come back to the United States, you're like, what do I feel right now? I feel fear. I literally feel fear. It's in the air. Everyone is exhausted because they know, and this is like a term that's called like bio-precarity, right? Which means that like not only are you precarious, but you're precarious in a way that specifically has to do with the health of your body. Like I come back to the United States and I know that the person next to me, even if they're wealthy, knows that if they got sick or someone else in their family got sick and somehow weren't able to work, that because of the way that insurance works in the United States and because of the way that money works in the United States, that you could literally be homeless and bankrupt in like a week, right? It's sort of like, it's so close. It's so close. And so like those fears, right, when we talk about like, oh, energy versus systems, like, okay, those fears are very tangible in the United States in a way that someone in Europe who had free college and who has free healthcare is not dealing with. Whether or not we both can then achieve the same ends is kind of a parallel conversation. And I do think it's possible. However, when we're talking about sort of the context within which we're doing that work, there are all of these scales of labor, of sort of emotional and energetic labor that have to happen in terms of like our reprogramming, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not to devalue, when we talk about like our ability to manifest, because I think, you'll see even memes around like, maybe it's manifestation, maybe it's white privilege. That's legit, right? Like that kind of pushback has to do with sort of like a lot of the more tone deaf conversations about manifestation that don't acknowledge disparity, right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't. And so we have to do both simultaneously. We have to be like, this exists. And also this is possible. And that, in the way that we've learned, is very hard to put back together, right? But like, I know that for me, like given what my body went through, given what finances that I came from, like if I decided to be someone who told my story in a different way, I'd be like, I was pregnant when I graduated from high school. I witnessed, I found my murdered relative 3 months later, right before leaving for college, in an incredibly brutal, bloody situation. I have been a victim of abuse. I have a partner who was emotionally abusive to me, who was an addict, who died. You know what I mean? Like again, like that could be, I have a boss who like, blackmailed me and put me in debt for tens of thousands of dollars that had nothing to do with it. I mean, literally, like I could be like, it's not possible for me to do anything. Like that could be my story. Right. And most people, like, it's funny, like people in my life who know those things, when I bring them up, will say, I never knew that, but they did. But the thing is, it's so not present in my field that they forget. That I swear, like I'm like, no, you knew. We've definitely talked about this. And they'll be like, are you sure? Yeah. How come I don't think about this? I'm like, because I don't think about it, right? Because and I did. And it's not like in any of those times those things weren't very present, but like that's not useful for me, right? Like I've processed it. But I also like understand that like that narrative and the power of the language around telling myself that like I am the person that like that happened to and that makes me a certain person, that is not helpful for me to get where I need to go. And to a certain extent, I think that my mechanisms are survival mechanisms, which I developed because of this, right? So like, whereas someone else who might have then been able to kind of fall back on financial situations that were easy or like family support or whatever, I was just kind of like sink or swim. So I've constantly in my life been doing something which I think of sort of as like, I think Brandon talks about this, like you throw yourself kind of out the window or off the cliff before knowing that anything's going to happen. You don't know that there's a parachute. You don't know that there's pillows down there, but you like literally just consistently throw yourself off the cliff. And this has been how a lot of the things in my life have happened, even things that like don't make sense. I'm like, I want to start traveling more, and I still don't travel a lot. But the first time I even like allowed myself to put a trip to see my friends on a credit card, so I'm like, I don't really have like a very supportive family structure. And so like I have what I consider to be kind of like my kin network. And so like the first time I was like, it's really important for me to visit these people. And I put a trip to see them in Canada on my credit card. And it was like, I had no reason to be able to do that. It made no sense financially. But then it kind of like, I worked it out because I had done it like afterwards, it kind of like, it became possible because I said that it was possible. And I know that, there's all sorts of ways to get up in arms about this and be like, that's not always the case. It's not always the case, right? But we can learn strategies to make these things possible. And when we energetically like align with it being something that's available to us, then it is more possible, right? If we really like hold ourselves tight against that being within our field, then it really isn't possible, right? So it's kind of the two things working in tandem. Yeah, I don't know. I went all over the place. I kind of, but yeah, there's my story. I mean, my story keeps going. It's like it's circuitous. It keeps going. But like, I mean, I teach. I love teaching, but I've also like worked in the service industry because it was a thing that was available to me, and that where I could make actually more money than teaching. And I believe in service. I think that, it should be like conscripted in the United States. Like you get out of high school, everybody has to work at a post office or something. It would make everybody much kinder. I sort of think this would be great. Like you get out of high school, like England gets a gap year. We have to go work in service. Like one of you has to work in a warehouse. You have to work in retail, because everyone should have to do it.
Yeah.
People are so mean to people in the service industry.
Actually, the last HeAd Posse guest, I think it was last week, or his name was Stefan, was all about this, all about the service industry, all about how he actually sees it as like his job to educate people who are in the service industry right now, also like how it can be such a gift, and how like to change the perspective of being in the service industry, and how like, to actually bring empowerment there, and how it's such a learning experience. So it's funny that you brought that up.
Well, that's funny. I mean, yeah, I think it totally, I mean, it's such an incredible site of interaction. I mean, especially as the economy in the States becomes more and more a service economy, and we are such consumers, like a lot of the places that we interact with strangers are actually in the service industry. Right. And so unless you choose the kind of life where you have more interactions with people that are not in your immediate circle, then the service industry becomes this kind of potential site of interface. And so I always used to kind of think about it as one sort of the Zen monk activity of folding napkins or polishing glasses or something very sort of I'm in the Zendo, polishing my glasses, whatever. But also sort of here I am and I have the opportunity to help this person's day go in this direction or that direction. And also I have these tattoos on my palms.
Oh, I love that. Wow.
Yeah. And so having to do with energy going into the left and out of the right, and how energy works in the body when you're doing energy work. And so I have this very visible story on my hands. And so as I would gesticulate to my tables, whatever, they'd be like, "Do you have tattoos on your hands?" And I'd be like, "I do." And they'd be like, "Well, do you mind if we ask about them?" And I'd be like, "Sure." And then guess what? I would tell a story about how energy works in the body. I'd be like, "Oh,
yeah,
you wouldn't know, but energy is meant to travel this way through this way." And, I have the heart, the eye, and the sort of all-seeing eye on the left hand, which has to do with the idea that when energy comes into the body, we often are thinking about the mind and the eye and what we see and what we think. But as energy leaves the body, I have on the other hand, the heart. I want to remind myself that I want to transmute that body and have it come out my heart center. And all these people are like, "Oh, that's so great." And then they, are having their meal, whatever, thinking about this alchemy of transmutation of energy in the body. I'm like, yes, I am here to give you this message with your lunch.
Yes. Love that.
Which is why I always think it's funny. It's if people are if people ask you about your tattoos and you're like, "No, I don't want to tell you." Oh, what? Why?
I always like talking about my tattoos, even the ones I don't know. They're all, tattoos are so fascinating to me because they're a lot of people that I encounter are like, "Well, don't you think you'll regret that?" Or "Don't you think that in a certain amount of time you won't like it anymore?" And I'm like, but even if that's true, and there are my first one, I don't love it, but I do love it because it came at the exact, it's almost, I just see it kind of as a map of where you've been. It's it's capturing a moment in time, regardless of what it is, but it's capturing that moment in time, that energy signature of what you were going through at that point in time, And so how could you agree? Yeah. So how could you not love that?
Yeah, I mean, one of my longest projects is a project about auto evolving and the ways in which we can evolve the species and our own bodies and our communities within our generation before it moves through to the next generation. Not only within genetic imprinting, but actually within your own within your own timeline. And so like one of the things that I talk about in that has to do with like meta tagging through body modification. So like the idea that we're actually like creating these other modes of like communicating to each other through modifying our bodies. And like that tattoo is part of that. So when we create like visible narrative, both for ourselves as well as for other people, and the story I just told like is part of that, right? We actually like shift the energy around our body signature because we continue to interface with those stories ourselves, and so do other people, right? And I mean, I think that, you know, even like dress and stuff are part of this. Like if we like really can consider intentionally the different ways in which we communicate with like everything that's on our bodies, as well as how we hold our bodies, as well as how we change our bodies, like we actually are doing these really, really interesting things with communication through that kind of another hacking, right?
I love that perspective. And it's so true. I mean, it makes me think about, you know, okay, so when people channel, right? Like when people channel there's, you know, videos where, like literally when they're channeling something else, the whole body changes. The whole body literally feels different. People say like it literally feels different. It's like, how is this possible? It's like, because you're literally like reorganizing the energy of your body, like you're saying. And something else that I was thinking of on that note is that, so I have another podcast with another Positive Head listener, Andy, right? And she channels. And she channels an Arcturian being named John, for lack of a better name. And he was telling us recently that the body is actually its own entity, right? So we have the spirit and then the body, and the body is its own thing in its own way. It has its own desires. It has its own way it wants to express. And it came up about tattoos, and it said that's actually the body wanting to express something. And it's for all different reasons. But, you know, using the example of getting a tattoo, for example, I have a tattoo right on my left side, and it says listen, and it was being expressed, you know, that was like the body's way of expressing itself and making that as a reminder for you. And I just thought it was really interesting to think about that, because normally and this goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning about, you know, the body and the mind being so connected. But I feel like we are typically thinking that like, well, almost that it's all one thing, and that the body like doesn't have its own, it's like the body's just being dragged along. And it's like, but the body actually is intelligent. The body actually has its own desires and wants. And like, I think it's very interesting to start perceiving it that way, you know, and then to think about how to work together.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for what you said, it's funny. I mean, that's interesting that John said that. Like something that I've actually said before about tattoos is that when have you ever heard about kind of like the carving of carving the David, like the famous statue of David, that like it was like you weren't actually carving into the stone. It was like the sculpture was like emerging out of the stone that already existed. I've often like thought about like tattoos as sort of like, it's not actually you're putting something on the skin. You're actually revealing the body. Ooh. Like you're not like adding to it. You're actually showing what's already there.
You're like,
I mean, you're scraping away.
Yes.
Like you're like actually exposing the real body underneath, right? Like it's
like showing the true colors, but in a positive way.
Yeah, in a positive way, but also like, you know, and that doesn't say also that the body can't change, because the body like evolves as the soul does. And so, you know, like it's not to say that like as I scrape something away that I wouldn't have put on later, it isn't, you know, it's just as part of me as like a part of my story that would not be happening now, but it's still there and I'm not shameful of it. But, I was going to say something else. Oh no, it's gone because I started talking about tattoos.
It's okay.
No, I know. So, yes. I mean, so I think that for a lot of us who do channel or who are really, really engaged with energetic, with sort of like mystic and energetic forces, and this is definitely true for me, like one of the weird things that's been very consistent with my experience is that like I experience a lot of disembodiment because I really have for most of my life sort of considered my body as sort of this like container for something that I'm extremely much more cognizant of. Like I'm extremely aware of like my larger self, my energetic self as like a multidimensional being that's moving in different timelines. And I like that has literally always been my like primary relationship with myself. And so the body is sort of this like other thing in which I'm housed, right? I'm very aware of like being housed here. And, and we can, in terms of the gender stuff, we can sort of talk about that too. I think like some of the weirdness for me has been kind of like already feeling like my primary relationship with myself is not in this body. Like I don't identify myself as the identity of this body, right? So like the idea that other people would primarily identify me as the person in this body is so kind of like bizarre, has always kind of been so bizarre. But also like in trying to integrate with this body has been really challenging, because I think that my natural mode, and this was like, was to be absent and sort of be like, yes, I'm here. Like, I know that that's what I need to be to like be on earth. I'm like in this body, but like, it's not me. And as soon as I have the opportunity, I'm going to like go sit by a tree and like leave, basically, for lack of a better word, right? Yeah. Or go into a book and leave, or go into my art and leave, right? I'm going to leave. I'm going to constantly leave. But that wasn't necessarily healthy. It was a practice, but it wasn't necessarily healthy. And it keeps me connected to the sort of larger energetic soup. But I think like that was reinforced by what I was kind of getting in school, like by this sort of like your body and your mind are separate. And I was kind of like, okay, great. You want to encourage my mind and my artistic practice. And like, I'm already out there in the soup. So like, I'm just going to totally, this body is going to be this random thing that I drag around until I die. Instead of actually really kind of being like, what does it mean to be in this person? And I think like part of my own engagement with and questioning of and like trying to really understand like gender and stuff like that has come from being like, I got to get back in the body to do my work, which has been kind of a little shocking for me. Like, like, okay, I really have to deal with this body. It's not just secondary, like in this lifeline. And like, what does that mean? Which has been like really, really super challenging.
Yeah. And I know, so I know you, and you just touched on it a couple times, bringing up the gender topic, and we have about 7 minutes left. So I want you to, so if that's something you want to talk about, I would love to hear more about that and your experience with that. In this time we have, if you can continue.
Yeah, what I can say briefly is like my own relationship to sort of like gender is that like gender is something that's assigned societally, like ideas about like what our genders are is really kind of like a societal construct. How many genders there are has changed in all different parts of history with all different groups, right? And it has to do with kind of like how the body is read and perceived culturally and socially, as opposed to like actually for the person and their experience. And so I think that for me, like I said before, my own relationship to my gender has always kind of been like, oh, well, I don't have a gender. I'm like a multi-gendered every energy being that like lives in this body, but I have a body that is very feminine because I'm very busty, I'm very curvy, and that has been the case since I was very young. And so my experience of being in the world has been very feminized, even when I didn't want it to be, right? I've really been treated in a way, sexualized and so forth, in a way that had a lot to do with what it meant to be a woman here. And so for me, giving myself permission to be like, I don't really understand myself as a gendered being. I don't. And sort of not only saying that is true for me in the kind of soup, but also in this body, and having ownership over that has been actually really validating, and also something that I think can be very socially progressive, because I think we do this really negative, dangerous, binary dualizing of people, right? We're like, women are this way, men are this way, and we make this real duality, kind of similar to like sexuality, what we used to do, right? There's this or there's this. No, there's a ton of gray area. There's all this stuff in between. And frankly, there also is a ton of gray area, even with the body, like even hormonally, that we don't talk about, right? And this just came up recently with that real big scandal with the runner, right? It's sort of like we have different amounts of hormones in our body. It's not even accurate to say that like men have this and women have this. Like that's not even medically true, right? And so as we move in that direction, I think that like for someone like myself, like it's actually very important for me to hold space as a non-binary person, because it says it opens up the conversation, right? And so same thing with sort of the creation of this new name for myself. I'm sort of like, listen, I can create my own name and I can tell you what gender I am. And you can do the same thing, right? And we can consistently trouble these distinctions, right? And doing that is part of continuing our growth as a species, right? So I feel like for me, like once that became available for me, there was like no question that I needed to do that, even though it's harder for me on a day-to-day basis, because I'm always like, those aren't my pronouns, and but I think that like engaging with people in your world who have those other things is where we do a lot of our learning, right? It can't only happen top down. That speed is really slow. You can't wait for institutional speed, right? Yeah. Institutional speed will be like 500 years, whatever. We'll all be dead. Yeah. If we wait for that, that's not going to happen, right? So as part of my work, it's part of my work to hold that space.
And to be the change, like to just
be the change,
to be it, to just do it. Exactly. Yeah, I love that. That's such a great message to send to everyone listening as well. It's like, don't wait. Do not wait for anything to change. Like if you want something to change, if you want whatever reality you want to live, put your energy into that and just make it so, because there's no more waiting. Like there's no more reason to wait.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and the idea that you can contain, the sort of the Walt Whitman, like you contain multitudes. You can contain multitudes. It doesn't mean I don't have femininity. It doesn't mean I don't have masculinity. It doesn't mean I don't both have a body and an ethereal self. Like it's, I love like the idea of non-duality. Non-duality, man. I mean, if all of us could really like get our heads around one concept, like that would be super helpful for everyone. Yeah. It's not either or, it's both. It's simultaneously existing. Right. Like it's and it's such a brain fuck, right? Like oh God, I said cursing on the radio.
Oh, that's okay. We curse here sometimes. That's fine.
But yeah,
I know it's interesting because I was just having this conversation with someone recently when we were talking about that concept in relation to politics, for example. And we'll just wrap up after this, but real quick, our society so far has been told, well, it's either red or blue. You have to pick either red or blue. And if you try to pick green or anything else, you're going to lose. So you got to pick red or blue because, and that's like pointless. For example, in the voting system, that's just wasting your vote. That's so small. That's not going to do anything. So you have to pick red or blue, going back to this duality binary thing, right? So it's exactly what you're saying. It's like, well, what if we all realized, keep getting this image of in that movie Ants, where there's a scene in that animated movie Ants, like it came out several years ago, but it was animated, and there was a scene in it where like the bad guy, and it was telling someone, he was like, we can't let the ants know how powerful they are. They have to stay focused on their jobs. If they all knew how powerful they were, they could overtake us in a night. Like, and it's this idea that like what's happening right now, I feel like, and what you were just saying is like, if everyone could just understand that you don't have to pick red or blue, that you could pick purple, you could pick teal, you could pick whatever, and we could all shift it, then we can create and choose whatever color or whatever decision or whatever new reality we want. It's just we've been sold this idea that it's only A or B, like you're saying. And I think
politically, it's a little bit different, right? Because systemically, like voting for a third party actually, like within our system is really dangerous. But like, I don't think that there is only red or blue, even within the parties. Like the idea that like there is a duality, that there is a binary is totally false, right? It is drag, right? People are performing duality in order to fit into a system, right? And a lot of it is actually like much more I love the ants metaphor. I mean, that's total. I mean, I think humans have a really hard time conceiving of scale. Mm-hmm. We really don't. Like, it's very hard for us to like understand how many people are the underclasses, like how physical many of us there are, like how powerful our numbers are. It's very, very hard for us to get that. But I think that like we really are more powerful beyond measure. Like I think that it's starting to, I think energetically we're moving in that direction. Like
Absolutely.
I really do. I really feel it. And it's exciting.
I 100% agree. And thank you so much. Yeah, we're all a part of it. I mean, you being here is a part of it. Me being here is a part of it. Everyone listening is a part of it. And And it's really exciting to be a part of it and to know that we chose to be a part of it in some larger way, in some, on some non-physical plane. That's exciting.
Oh, absolutely.
So, thank you so much for, choosing to reach out and share your story and all of your wisdom. And just really quick, while we're wrapping up, where can people find you and find everything that you're working on? How can they reach you? Yeah.
Okay, so you can find my organization, which is pretty easy. It's the easiest of the websites. It's the operatingsystem.org. Both the operating system and I are on like all social media platforms. My own name can be searched, and I have like my digital CV online. My website is like under reconstruction, but that's like only what I can. .org. So my sort of handles online are only what I can, and the trouble with Bartleby, and you can find me under any of those things, but definitely through the operating system, you can sort of find anything. And everybody, people can get that workbook too. That sort of a biohacking workbook is a thing that's available both in print and digitally. So
cool. I'm going to check that out for sure. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eli, for being here. And it was beautiful to connect with you, and hope you have an amazing weekend.
You too.
Awesome.
Bye.
That's it for this week's episode. If you're a listener with a story to share and are interested in being featured on a future episode of this special series, you can email me at alexa@positivehead.com. Also, if you're craving more consciousness elevating content, be sure to check out Gaia, which is the go-to source for streaming consciousness content on the web, where you can stream an incredible 7,000 plus exclusive videos covering 5,000 years of wisdom. As you all hear Brandon constantly say, it's a daily conscious effort to maintain an elevated vibration. And if you're looking to journey deep down the rabbit hole to do so, then Gaia is the best place we know of to do it. Period. And you can sign up for your first month for only 99 cents at gaia.com/positivehead. That's spelled GAIA.com/positivehead. Check it out. Otherwise, tune in next Friday for another HeAd Posse episode. And until then, as Brandon always says, journey well.